The school nurse called Tuesday morning and said my 12-year-old daughter, Sophie, had collapsed outside her science classroom. By the time I reached the hospital, she was awake but pale beneath a thin blanket. Then the nurse looked at me and asked a question I didn't understand. Did anything change after you signed her new medical plan? I stared at her. What medical plan? She turned the screen toward me. At the bottom was David Hale, beneath a signature that looked like mine. There was one problem. I had never seen that document in my life. The nurse told me what had happened while Sophie rested behind the curtain. She had been in science class when the guidance counselor asked her to step into the hallway. Nothing about that sounded unusual at first. I kept watching her breathe. According to the nurse, the counselor wanted to discuss an upcoming evaluation. Sophie had gone quiet immediately. Her face lost color. She asked what the evaluation was for, then whether her father had already agreed to it. Less than a minute later, she said she felt dizzy. The counselor tried to guide her toward a bench, but Sophie never made it. Her knees buckled in the middle of the hallway. A teacher caught her shoulder before her head struck the floor, and the school nurse arrived within moments. By then, Sophie was conscious, but shaking. Her pulse had been fast. Her breathing had been shallow. She kept saying she was sorry, though nobody had accused her of doing anything wrong. The nurse said Sophie seemed more frightened than confused, which bothered me almost as much as the collapse itself. Sophie hated disappointing people. The paramedics had checked her blood sugar, oxygen level, blood pressure, and heart rhythm before transporting her. Nothing immediately explained why she had gone down. At the hospital, the emergency physician repeated those tests and added blood work. So far, he said, nothing suggested a major physical crisis. That should have relieved me. It did. Then I looked through the glass at my daughter. Sophie was 12 years old. She had never fainted at school. She had never needed a behavioral evaluation that I knew about, and she had certainly never needed a medical plan. The doctor stepped closer and lowered his voice. Right now she appears stable. We want to observe her for a while and make sure nothing changes. Anxiety can cause very real physical symptoms, but I don't want to assume that's what happened until we've ruled out other causes. I nodded, but my attention kept returning to the tablet in the nurse's hands. What was the counselor talking to her about? I asked. The nurse glanced at the screen. A scheduled behavioral evaluation. It looks like part of her current support plan. Current support plan, I repeated. The words felt wrong in my mouth. How long has she had one? The nurse hesitated, not because she seemed nervous, but because she was checking the record before answering. The formal plan was entered a little over 2 months ago. I looked at Sophie again, 2 months. During that time, I had attended parent-teacher night, helped her build a model bridge for science class, and argued with her about leaving cereal bowls in the sink. Not once had anyone mentioned a behavioral support plan to me. Who requested it? I asked. The nurse scrolled. I don't want to give you incomplete information. The counselor can explain the school side better, and the outside clinic may have additional records. But the documents here show that a parent authorized information sharing. A parent, I said. She looked at me. Yes, I wanted to ask whether she meant Rebecca. Instead, I forced myself to slow down. A hospital hallway was the wrong place to build a conclusion from half a sentence and a digital form I had seen for 30 seconds. The nurse seemed to read the question on my face anyway. Mr. Hale, nobody here is accusing anyone of anything. From the school's perspective, we believed the appropriate parental permissions were already in place. Sophie has been meeting with staff under that understanding. I asked to see Sophie before we discussed anything else. The nurse led me back. Sophie opened her eyes when I sat down beside her. Dad, she whispered. I took her hand. I'm here. Her fingers tightened around mine. Did I mess everything up? No, I said immediately. You didn't mess anything up. She stared at me as if she needed to hear it twice. I wanted to ask about the evaluation, the counselor, the form, and why she looked terrified. Instead, I told her to rest and stayed until her breathing slowed. When I stepped back into the hallway, the nurse was waiting with the tablet. I'll get you copies of what we have, she said. The counselor can speak with you later today. Then she paused. I assumed you already knew most of this. Your wife has been handling most of this with us. My name is David Hale. I was 45 years old and I had made a living finding things people hoped nobody would test. I was a forensic accountant and one of 3 partners at a small advisory firm that handled fraud investigations and financial disputes. Most of my work began after someone insisted the numbers were fine. A company would lose money. A partner would deny moving funds. A lawsuit would depend on reconstructing who knew what, when they knew it, and which document told a different story. I learned that fraud rarely announced itself with one dramatic transaction. It hid inside ordinary records, an invoice that arrived 2 days too early, a login from the wrong city, a payment split into smaller amounts. Nothing looked important until the pieces were placed side by side. That was why clients hired me. I reconciled emails, access logs, expense reports, contracts, and timelines until the version people remembered had to compete with the version the records could actually support. I trusted patterns, but only after I had tested every innocent explanation first. Sophie was nothing like the people I investigated. She was 12, sharp enough to notice when adults contradicted themselves, and quiet enough that adults underestimated how much she heard. She loved science, sketching floor plans, and documentaries about storms. Trouble was something she tried to avoid. If Sophie had one habit that worried me, it was how badly she hated disappointing anyone. She apologized when teachers corrected her. She apologized when I forgot something. Once, after getting sick before a dinner, she apologized to Rebecca for ruining the reservation. I told her. Her mother, Laura, died when Sophie was 8. Cancer took the morning. I found myself standing in our kitchen with a child who kept asking what we were supposed to do next. For a while, the answer to almost everything was simply survive the day. I met Rebecca a year later. She was organized where I was scattered, socially effortless, where I could be distracted, and patient with Sophie that made me believe I had been lucky twice. We married nearly 3 years before the day Sophie collapsed. Rebecca began handling more of the routines I was bad at protecting from work. School emails, dentist appointments, soccer registrations, birthday invitations, permission slips. She knew which teacher preferred phone calls and which clinic always ran late. I told myself at first that division of labor made us efficient. The truth was less flattering. My firm had grown quickly, and so had the number of cases requiring travel. Dallas for depositions, Atlanta for interviews, Boston for document review. Sometimes I was gone 2 nights, sometimes 4. I always came home believing presence could be measured by how quickly I returned. Rebecca never complained much about it. That made it easier. If I missed a school meeting, she attended. If Sophie needed a routine appointment, Rebecca took her. When I thanked her, she usually said the same thing. We're a team, David. You don't have to do everything yourself. I believed her because I wanted to believe the arrangement was working. Sophie still called me from the grocery aisle to ask which cereal to buy. We still watched old disaster movies on Friday nights. I helped with homework when I was home. Nothing felt broken enough to make me inspect it. That was the irony I could not ignore in the hospital. Professionally, I had spent years warning executives that control problems rarely looked like emergencies at first. They looked like convenience. One person handled something because everyone trusted them, and nobody noticed how much authority had quietly accumulated. Rebecca had not stolen access to Sophie's life. I had handed her much of it, one reasonable responsibility at a time. School contact, appointments, forms, schedules. I had never imagined those ordinary permissions could be used to build a story about my daughter that I had never been told. Sitting beside Sophie's hospital bed, I understood something I was not ready to admit aloud. I was very good at reading other people's ledgers. But somewhere between flights, deadlines, and the confidence that my family was fine, I might have stopped reading the one being written inside my own house. Rebecca arrived less than 40 minutes after the nurse finished speaking with me. She came through the hospital doors wearing charcoal slacks, a pale blue blouse, and the expression she used whenever something serious required everyone else to remain calm. She looked composed enough that for a moment I wondered whether I was already overreacting. She kissed my cheek, then went straight to Sophie. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm here." Her voice softened immediately. She adjusted the blanket, asked whether the lights were bothering her, and thanked the nurse for staying with us. Rebecca had always been good in rooms where people were watching. The nurse explained the collapse again. Rebecca listened without interrupting, nodding at the right moments. When the doctor mentioned anxiety as one possible explanation, she exhaled as if that confirmed something she had been carrying alone. "She's been struggling emotionally for a while," she said. I turned toward her. "For a while?" Rebecca looked surprised by my tone. "David, we've talked about this." She said it gently enough that anyone nearby might have assumed I was the confused one. "You've just been so busy that I don't think you realized how serious it had become." That sentence landed exactly where it was supposed to. I had been busy. I had missed things. There were weeks when Rebecca knew more about Sophie's schedule than I did. If she wanted to make me doubt myself, she did not need to invent a weakness. She only needed to use one I already had. I kept my face still. What has she been struggling with? Rebecca glanced toward Sophie before answering. Anxiety, mood changes, problems sleeping. She gets overwhelmed sometimes. The list sounded practiced, not because it was dramatic, but because each phrase came out in the same measured tone. How long? I asked. Months, on and off. Not doctors exactly. Counselors. People who could help. Rebecca lowered her voice. I didn't want to scare you every time Sophie had a bad week when you were traveling. The explanation was almost reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Rebecca was not claiming a secret diagnosis. She was describing herself as the parent who had quietly handled routine problems while I was away, sparing me details because she believed they were manageable. The nurse returned with water for Sophie. Rebecca thanked her by name, although I had not heard anyone introduce them that morning. The nurse smiled back with the familiarity of someone who had spoken to Rebecca before. Another tiny fact, not proof, just one more thing I had not known. I asked Rebecca, what evaluation was she worried about? Her answer came before I finished the question. Just another behavioral assessment. She reached for Sophie's cup and adjusted the straw. Nothing dramatic. The school is being cautious because she's had some difficult days. I looked at her. I had not told Rebecca that the counselor pulled Sophie from class to discuss his evaluation. I had not used the word behavioral. The nurse had told me privately in the hallway before Rebecca arrived. Yet Rebecca knew exactly which evaluation I meant. For 1 second, I considered asking how she knew. Then I remembered how often people filled silence when they believed the other person knew less than they did. At work, the fastest way to ruin an interview was to reveal every document on the table before the other person finished talking. So I gave Rebecca nothing. Okay, I said. She watched me closely. Okay? The doctor says Sophie is stable. That's what matters right now. Rebecca's shoulders loosened a fraction. It was small enough that I might have missed it if I had not spent years watching people react to incomplete information. She sat beside Sophie and began explaining the morning to the doctor as though she had been present at school. She mentioned panic, resistance to evaluation, worsening anxiety, and several recent episodes at home. Each detail sounded polished. Each one expanded a history I had never heard. The doctor asked whether Sophie had ever lost consciousness before. Rebecca shook her head. Not like this. The answer was technically careful. I noticed that too. Not no. Not never. Not like this. I filed the wording away without deciding what it meant. Then Rebecca looked at me and softened her expression. She's been having a difficult year, David. You just haven't been here for most of it. Nobody in the room reacted. To them, it sounded like concern. To me, it sounded like both an explanation and a warning. Once Sophie was settled that morning, and the doctor stepped away, I asked the nurse for the document she had shown me. She hesitated only long enough to confirm I was Sophie's legal parent, then printed a packet titled Student Medical and Behavioral Support Plan. The first page looked ordinary. Sophie's name, her grade, emergency contacts. A summary describing anxiety, emotional dysregulation, difficulty with transitions, and episodes of withdrawal. None of those phrases sounded impossible. What bothered me was how confidently the document presented them as established facts. The second page listed Rebecca as the primary coordinating parent for school communication. My name was still there, but beneath hers. The form also authorized the school to share records with an outside behavioral clinic. I recognized from one of the nurse's earlier references. I kept reading. There was language allowing counseling, behavioral monitoring, and an intensive evaluation if Sophie's symptoms increased. Again, none of that was inherently alarming. Schools create support plans. Parents authorized them every day. The problem was that I had supposedly authorized this one. At the bottom of page 4 was my name beneath a signature, David Hale. The signature looked disturbingly accurate. Same long first stroke in the D, same compressed H. Even the upward angle at the end was something I had done without thinking. I stared at it. The nurse asked whether I was all right. I'm trying to remember signing this. She pointed to the date. According to the file, parental acknowledgement was completed that afternoon. I read the date again, slower this time, November 17th. I knew the week because my firm's largest cases had gone into emergency mediation. I had spent 3 days in Nashville with attorneys, executives, and 2 forensic teams arguing over revenue recognition inside a conference room with no windows. But knowing I had been out of town did not prove anything. I signed documents remotely all the time. Contracts arrived through secure portals. Engagement letters showed up on my phone between flights. There were days when I approved 6 documents before breakfast and remembered only half their titles afterward. That possibility bothered me because it was plausible. Maybe Rebecca had sent me the plan. Maybe I had skimmed it between meetings and signed without understanding what it was. Maybe the mystery was not that someone had forged my name. Maybe the mystery was how careless I had been. I asked the nurse whether the school could tell how the signature had been collected. She scrolled through the electronic record. This copy was uploaded by the clinic, she said. We received it as part of the coordinated support documentation. The clinic may have the original workflow. The clinic? I asked. Yes, the OUT's behavioral practice. It says the plan was reviewed with parent there before the school finalized accommodations. I looked back at the page. That wording mattered more than the signature itself. Reviewed with parent at the clinic sounded like a meeting, not an email. Does it say which parent? The nurse checked again. Not on this screen. The uploaded form has your signature and Rebecca Hale is listed as coordinating parent. She paused. If there's a discrepancy, the counselor and clinic should be able to provide the source documents. I thanked her and took the packet to an empty chair near Sophie's room. I read every page again, this time the way I would read a file for a client, not looking for what the document claimed, looking for where the claim came from, who entered it, and when. Then I returned to the signature page and forced myself not to jump ahead. My work had taught me that memory was evidence people trusted far too easily, especially their own. I had watched intelligent executives swear something never happened until an email showed them approving it personally. I was not going to make that mistake because the document frightened me. Before accusing anyone, I needed to prove the one thing my career had trained me never to assume, that my memory was better than the record. So I photographed every page and wrote down November 17th. Then I noticed one final line beneath the signature block. It was smaller than everything around it, almost administrative. Plan reviewed with parent at clinic prior to acknowledgement. I read it twice. If that sentence meant what it appeared to mean, then somewhere there should be a record of me being physically present. I folded the packet and looked through the glass at Rebecca sitting beside Sophie, smoothing my daughter's hair while speaking softly to the doctor. I still did not know who had signed the form, but for the first time I knew exactly which question I needed the records to answer. The doctor let me sit with Sophie once her blood work came back normal. She looked smaller than usual beneath the hospital blanket, her hair still flattened on one side from where she had rested against the pillow. When she opened her eyes, she looked embarrassed before she looked relieved. I expected her to ask when we could go home. Instead, she stared at the plastic bracelet around her wrist and whispered, "Am I in trouble?" The question hit me harder than anything the nurse had said. "No," I told her. "Why would you think you're in trouble?" Sophie shrugged without looking at me. Her fingers worried the edge of the blanket, "Because I made everybody come here." I told her she had not made anyone do anything. She had gotten dizzy, she had fallen, and the adults around her had done exactly what they were supposed to do. She nodded, but the tension did not leave her face. I had seen Sophie nervous before spelling tests, soccer tryouts, even birthday parties where she did not know many kids. This was different. She kept watching the doorway as if she expected someone to enter before she decided what she was allowed to say. I kept my voice casual. "The counselor said you were upset about an evaluation." Sophie's eyes moved to mine, then away again. "It's nothing, you fainted in a hallway." "I know. So I'm trying to understand what scared you." She pulled the blanket higher over her stomach. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie asked very quietly, "Did Rebecca tell you?" I felt something inside me tighten. "Tell me what?" Sophie immediately shook her head. "Nothing. Never mind." The answer came too quickly, almost like she had stepped onto a line she knew she should not cross. I could have pushed. Every instinct in me wanted to. I wanted to ask what Rebecca had said, what Sophie thought the evaluation meant, why she believed getting sick could somehow put her in trouble. But an anxious child was not a witness I needed to corner. She was my daughter. The doctor came in a few minutes later and confirmed Sophie could probably go home after another period of observation. Before leaving, he pulled me aside. "Try not to question her too much tonight," he said. "If something is worrying her, pressure can make it harder for her to explain clearly." I told him I understood. He suggested letting Sophie speak in her own time and arranging a neutral counselor if her fear about the evaluation continued. That advice frustrated the part of me that wanted answers immediately, but professionally I knew he was right. Leading questions can damage good information faster than bad records. When I returned to her bedside, Sophie was staring at the ceiling. I sat down and took her hand. "I'm not going to make you explain anything right now," I said. She looked at me carefully. "Even if Rebecca already told you, even then." Her grip tightened around my fingers. "You can tell me anything when you're ready," I said. "And whatever it is, you're not in trouble for telling me." Sophie swallowed and nodded. She did not explain. She did not mention the form, the clinic, or the evaluation again, but she stopped watching the doorway quite so often. I thought about every phone call from my trips when Rebecca had told me Sophie was tired, moody, or already asleep. I accepted those descriptions because they sounded ordinary. Now I wondered whether Sophie had been hearing a different version of those same weeks when I was not there. The hardest part was pretending patients felt responsible. I was used to solving problems by gathering information, not by waiting for someone I loved to feel safe enough to speak. But if Rebecca had taught Sophie to fear reactions, then my first job was not extracting truth. It was changing that fear. That should have comforted me. It did not. The question kept repeating in my head while Sophie rested beside me. Not what had happened at school. Not whether the document was real. Something more personal had entered the story now. What exactly had Rebecca told my daughter that Sophie was afraid I might already know? At the next morning, while Sophie slept at home with my sister nearby, I contacted the school and requested her complete student support file. I did not ask for summaries. I asked for the records themselves, counselor notes, accommodation forms, attendance entries, teacher observations, meeting logs, and every document tied to the plan. I saved everything. The counselor was cooperative. As Sophie's father, I had the right to review the file, and by early afternoon a secure folder appeared in my inbox. I opened it expecting a handful of forms. Instead, I found months of documentation I had never known existed. The folder contained 43 separate entries. Total. There were counselor meetings in September, October, November, and December. There were behavior observations, modified classroom accommodations, missed assignments, and requests allowing Sophie to leave class when she felt overwhelmed. Some notes referred to a quiet room where she could decompress before returning to instruction. Several carried Rebecca's initials. None of those things by themselves frightened me. A child could need support without a parent recognizing every sign. What frightened me was the language surrounding them. In one summary, Sophie was described as emotionally volatile. In another, she was called increasingly withdrawn and oppositional at home. I had never seen them. A third note said she displayed irrational fears regarding ordinary family expectations. Another said she sometimes distorted events when anxious. I read that sentence twice. It was not a diagnosis. It was not even presented as something a clinician had personally witnessed. But once written down, it looked authoritative. That detail stayed with me. I started with the oldest records and read forward. The first counselor note described Sophie as quiet, polite, and reluctant to discuss home. The next month, the language became stronger, resistant, emotionally dysregulated, fearful of consequences. By winter, the file sounded like it belonged to a child I barely recognized. The progression was too neat. Then I opened the teacher comments. Sophie's science teacher wrote, "Excellent work. Cooperative in class. Occasionally appears tired." Her English teacher described her as quiet but engaged. Math noted 2 missed assignments and 1 tearful afternoon after a quiz. None of them described volatility, aggression, or defiance. Those comments sounded like Sophie. I went back to the behavioral summary. Frequent oppositional episodes at home. Then the science note. Respectful and prepared, behavioral summary. Increasing pattern of irrational fear. English teacher reserved, participates when called on. The contrast was not proof of anything, but it was impossible to ignore. I circled every contradiction. Children behave differently at home than they do at school. I knew that a quiet student could melt down behind closed doors. A cooperative 12-year-old could become angry with family. I refused to turn one set of notes into the truth simply because I preferred what they said. I needed more than instinct. So I created 2 columns. The first was labeled Direct Observation. The second was labeled Report by Kid Caregiver. I went through every serious statement in the file and marked where it originated. The exercise took less than an hour. The pattern it produced took much longer to accept. I saved a clean copy. Most of the mild concerns came from people who had actually been with Sophie. Tired, anxious, withdrawn on certain days, missed homework, occasional tears. Almost every severe description came from the same source. explosive behavior, persistent defiance, irrational fears, manipulative statements, all entered after conversations with Rebecca. The source mattered more now. One counselor note was especially careful. Stepmother reports Sophie becomes highly agitated when limits are set at home. Behavior not observed during session. Another said, caregiver describes episodes of prolonged crying and accusation. Student remained calm and minimally verbal during meeting. The distinction was sitting there in plain language. I highlighted both phrases. The school had not done anything obviously wrong. Staff had received concerns from a parent, documented them, and tried to support a student. The more I read, the less interested I became in blaming teachers. They had been working from information they reasonably believed came from Sophie's family. That distinction mattered to me. But the records also showed how repetition could turn one person's description into institutional history. A concern appeared in one meeting, then surfaced in a later summary, then became background for another accommodation. By the third document, the original source was easy to forget unless someone went looking for it. I leaned back from my laptop and looked at the two columns. On paper, two versions of my daughter existed side by side. One was quiet, capable, occasionally anxious, and struggling on certain days. The other was volatile, oppositional, fearful, and increasingly unreliable. Why did every serious symptom appear first in Rebecca's description? The school file gave me one side of the pattern. The medical portal gave me another. That evening, after Sophie went to bed, I logged into our insurance account and filtered every claim connected to her name from the previous 12 months. The first few entries were ordinary. Annual pediatric visit, dental cleaning, one urgent care claim from a sore throat I remembered. Then unfamiliar names began appearing, a behavioral therapist across town, a developmental clinic 40 minutes away, and an adolescent counseling practice I had never heard Rebecca mention. I opened the oldest one first, initial consultation. Rebecca listed as accompanying adult. The next visit was similar. Then another provider. Then a follow-up. Some had brief descriptions such as anxiety screening or family concerns. Others offered almost no detail beyond billing codes and dates. Nothing about seeing a therapist was suspicious on its own. Nothing about a parent taking a child to counseling was wrong. If Sophie had been struggling, I wanted her supported. What I could not understand was why that support had been built almost entirely outside my awareness. I checked our primary pediatrician's portal next. Their notes showed routine care, vaccinations, minor illnesses, and one conversation about school stress. They did not show referrals matching several of the outside clinics that did not make the other appointments improper. It made the path to them harder to explain. I started writing dates into a spreadsheet. Not conclusions, just facts. Appointment date, provider, reason listed, accompanying adult, referral source when available. I deliberately left one column blank where my anger wanted me to type Rebecca. I was not building an accusation. I was building a chronology. The chronology grew faster than I expected. September 3rd, counseling intake. September 19th, follow-up. October 8th, developmental consultation. October 26th, counselor visit. November 17th, the clinic connected to the school support plan. December 2nd, another behavioral appointment. January 9th, adolescent counseling. Rebecca appeared as accompanying adult on nearly every record that identified one. 2 forms listed only caregiver, 1 listed stepmother, none listed me. I searched my email for the clinic names and found almost nothing beyond automated insurance notices buried among hundreds of messages. That was when I realized how easy this had been to miss. Insurance explanations arrived electronically. Rebecca handled scheduling. Clinics called the number listed as primary contact. I traveled. A system designed to coordinate care had functioned exactly as configured. The problem was who had configured it. I went back through text messages with Rebecca. On several appointment dates, our conversations looked completely normal. Pick up milk. Sophie finished her project. Flight delayed? Not once did Rebecca say she had taken my daughter to a behavioral clinic that afternoon. One date bothered me more than the others. I had texted from an airport asking how Sophie was doing. Rebecca replied, "Good. Just tired from school." Insurance showed that less than 2 hours earlier, Sophie had completed a 45-minute behavioral assessment across town. I called the insurance helpline and asked whether the claims showed who scheduled the visits. The representative could not see every clinic's internal records, but she confirmed the contact information submitted with several claims matched Rebecca's phone number. Again, useful fact. still not proof of intent. I also noticed that some visits had been routed through providers Sophie had never seen before, instead of the pediatrician who had treated her for years. There could be reasons for that, including availability. But each new provider meant another professional, receiving Rebecca's version of events without mine. I stared at those two records side by side. Maybe Rebecca had not wanted to worry me. Maybe she considered the appointment routine. Maybe Sophie had asked for privacy. I kept giving every innocent explanation room to survive, because if one did, I wanted to find it. But innocent explanations became harder to maintain as the entries accumulated. Different clinics, different months, similar concerns, the same accompanying adult, the same father absent from every conversation. Whatever Rebecca had been doing, she had not invented it after Sophie's collapse at school. By midnight, my spreadsheet held enough rows that scrolling became necessary. I saved copies of the claims and shut the laptop for 5 minutes. Then I opened it again and added one new column beside every appointment. I titled it with the simplest question I could ask: where was I? The new column changed the spreadsheet immediately. I started with September 3rd, the first counseling intake I had not known about. Where was I, Charlotte? I had flown out that morning for a 2-day fraud interview. Rebecca had known the trip was confirmed almost a week earlier. September 3rd. Charlotte counseling intake, Rebecca. I wrote the 4 facts on one line and moved down. September 19th, Dallas. Behavioral follow-up, Rebecca. That appointment had been scheduled the afternoon, after I emailed my flight itinerary to Rebecca so she would know when I would be home. October 8th, Nashville. Developmental consultation, Rebecca. I had been in Tennessee reviewing acquisition records for a client. The appointment time fell almost exactly between a text from me saying I had landed and another that evening asking whether Sophie had finished her math project. October 26th was different. I had been home. I felt a quick, almost embarrassing surge of relief. Then I checked the time. The appointment happened during a full-day deposition downtown, one Rebecca knew had been blocked on my calendar for weeks. I had been nearby but unavailable. I stopped and reminded myself that none of this proved selection. Families schedule appointments around work every day. If Rebecca handled most of Sophie's routine logistics, of course many visits would happen when I was busy. A pattern without a reasonable baseline could become whatever I wanted it to become. So I widened the comparison. I pulled every ordinary appointment from the same year: dentist, pediatrician, soccer physical, eye exam. Those were scattered across my schedule. Some happened while I traveled. Several happened while I was home. Rebecca had told me about nearly all of them. The behavioral appointments looked different. November 17th, Nashville again. Clinic visit tied to the support plan. Rebecca. December 2nd, Boston. Behavioral follow-up, Rebecca. January 9th, New York. Adolescent counseling, Rebecca. The most serious conversations clustered around the moments when I could not easily join them. Then I checked when the appointments had been booked. That detail was available only for some providers, but where it existed, it bothered me more. 2 appointments were requested within 24 hours after Rebecca received confirmation of an upcoming trip. One was booked the same evening I purchased my flight. I created another column, date scheduled. Then another, travel confirmed. I hated how clinical the screen looked because the subject was my daughter. But stripping away emotion helped me see what anger might distort. The sequence mattered. In several cases, my absence was known before the appointment existed. I checked Rebecca's explanation against the timeline. She had said she handled things because I was busy. That could still be true. But handling an appointment because I happened to be away was different from creating an appointment after learning exactly when I would be away. I printed the spreadsheet and laid the pages across my dining table. It was after 1 in the morning. The house was silent. Upstairs, Sophie was asleep. Rebecca was staying with her sister after telling me we both needed space following the hospital argument. I had not objected. On paper, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Charlotte, Dallas, Nashville, Boston, New York. Different cities for me. Different providers for Sophie, the same adult beside her. I drew a small mark next to every appointment involving the strongest descriptions of emotional instability. Almost all of them aligned with my absence. One exception remained, and I was glad it did. A perfect pattern would have tempted me to trust it too quickly. The October appointment had occurred while I was technically in town, but even there, Rebecca knew I was locked inside a deposition and unreachable for most of the day. I went back to my emails and found one message I had sent Rebecca before Boston. Schedule is final. I leave Monday, back Thursday night. The next morning, the behavioral clinic logged a request for a Wednesday appointment. I read the timestamps 3 times before adding them to the sheet. That distinction changed my role. Until then, I had been a father reacting to information other people possessed. Now I had a question the records could test, and for the first time I knew clearly where to look next. By then, I was no longer asking whether Rebecca had simply forgotten to keep me informed. I was asking whether my absence had become part of the scheduling process itself. I still had no proof of why. I had no proof of deception. It wasn't proof, but it was no longer random. The next morning, I stopped reading the provider summaries like a worried father and started reading them like an accountant. I created 3 categories on a legal pad: direct observation, Sophie's own statements, and caregiver-reported symptoms. Then I went line by line through every record I had. The distinction changed everything. Patient appeared quiet and guarded. During session was a direct observation. Sophie says, "School feels overwhelming," sometimes came from my daughter, but the most alarming statements had a different beginning. Over and over, the same phrase appeared: stepmother reports. Stepmother reports escalating defiance at home. Stepmother reports prolonged emotional outbursts. Stepmother reports irrational fear of ordinary household expectations. Stepmother reports repeated accusations that cannot be verified. The wording shifted slightly between clinics, but the source remained the same: Rebecca. I checked whether the clinicians had personally observed the behavior described. In several cases, they had not. One therapist wrote that Sophie remained calm throughout the appointment. Another noted that she was withdrawn but cooperative. A third documented no aggression, no threats, and no disruptive behavior during the visit. That did not mean the clinicians were careless. They were recording what a parent told them, exactly as they were supposed to. Medical records often contain both observation and history. The problem begins when someone later reads the history, as if the clinician personally witnessed every event inside it. I started tracing language backward. A December note said Sophie had persistent oppositional behavior and distorted perceptions during conflict. The same phrase appeared in a November clinic summary to Sue. That November summary referenced parent report. The original October note was more specific. Stepmother describes child as oppositional during limit setting. One description had moved through 3 records and become stronger each time, not because 3 professionals had independently seen the same thing, but because each professional had inherited the language from an earlier file. The repetition created weight. The source created the appearance of confirmation. I found the same thing with irrational fears. In one record, Rebecca reported that Sophie feared being punished for minor mistakes. In a later summary, the wording became persistent irrational fear of routine consequences. By January, the phrase appeared without Rebecca's name beside it at all. I sat back and looked at the progression. That was how narratives hardened. A statement entered as caregiver history. Then it was summarized, then copied, then treated as background. 6 weeks later, nobody reading page 1 could easily tell whether the behavior had been witnessed or merely reported. Sophie's own statements were much narrower. She said she felt nervous at home sometimes. She said she hated upsetting people. She said she worried adults would be disappointed in her. None of those statements proved Rebecca was lying. But none matched the severe portrait Rebecca had been constructing either. I called the behavioral therapist's office and asked only procedural questions I was entitled to ask. Had the provider personally witnessed major outbursts? The receptionist could not interpret notes, but the clinician later returned my call and confirmed that the most serious home behaviors had been described by Rebecca, not observed in session. He sounded almost apologetic. I told him he did not need to be. He had documented the source accurately. If there was a problem, it was not that professionals had written down what they were told. The problem was whether the person doing the telling had been truthful. By then, I understood why the school file and medical file looked so convincing from a distance. They contained real appointments, real professionals, real observations, and real concern. But buried inside that legitimacy was one repeated voice shaping the most frightening parts of the story. Then I reached a January summary from the adolescent counseling practice. Most of it repeated familiar language about anxiety, defiance, and family stress. Near the bottom, one sentence stopped me cold. Family has begun considering residential stabilization if home environment becomes unmanageable. I searched the records for any note showing that I had participated in that discussion. There was no phone call with me, no email from me, no intake meeting bearing my name, and no documented conversation in which I agreed that Sophie's home had become unsafe or unmanageable. I read it again, family. Not Rebecca. Not stepmother. Family. The sentence made it sound as if Sophie's removal from our home had already been discussed and accepted by both parents. I had never discussed residential treatment with anyone. I had never even heard the phrase applied to my daughter. The word residential stayed with me, long after I closed the counseling note. I knew enough not to treat residential care as a threat by definition. Some children genuinely need intensive treatment, and some families reach that decision after exhausting every reasonable option. That was not what frightened me. What frightened me was that someone had apparently started that process for Sophie without telling me. I searched the insurance portal for anything connected to residential care, stabilization, intake, or behavioral placement. 20 minutes later, a name appeared that I had never seen before: Oak Ridge Youth Wellness Center. Oak Ridge was a specialized program several hours away. Its website described structured behavioral support, academic coordination, family therapy, and short-term residential stabilization for adolescents with significant emotional needs. Nothing on the page looked sinister. In the right circumstances, it probably helped families who desperately needed it. Then I opened the insurance activity. Oak Ridge had requested a preliminary benefits review for Sophie 6 weeks earlier. It was not an admission authorization, and no placement had been approved. But someone had provided enough information for the facility to ask whether our policy would cover an evaluation and possible stay. I called the insurer and identified myself as Sophie's father and policyholder. I was careful not to ask for anything outside my rights. The representative confirmed a benefits inquiry had been submitted by Oak Ridge. She could not discuss the center's internal conversations, but she could tell me the inquiry existed. I called Oak Ridge next. The intake coordinator was cautious, which I respected. After verifying my identity and parental status, she confirmed that there had been preliminary contact regarding Sophie. No admission has occurred, she emphasized. This was exploratory. I asked who had initiated the inquiry. There was a pause while she checked the file. Rebecca Hale is listed as the contacting parent. I wrote the sentence down. What did she ask you? Another pause. I can tell you the categories documented in the intake inquiry, but I can't interpret motive. Rebecca had asked about eligibility requirements, typical length of stay, school transfer procedures, family visitation, insurance coverage, and how quickly an intake could be arranged if Sophie's home behavior escalated. She had also asked whether one parent could begin preliminary screening before the other attended a formal conference. That last question made my hands stop moving. What did you tell her? The coordinator said both legal and clinical requirements depended on custody, consent, and the specifics of the case. Nothing had advanced to final enrollment. There had been no admission date and no completed clinical acceptance. I thanked her because those distinctions mattered. I was not going to turn an inquiry into an attempted kidnapping simply because I was angry. Rebecca had not placed Sophie at Oak Ridge. She had not completed enrollment. She had, however, gone far beyond casually searching treatment options online. She had spoken to intake, asked about insurance, asked about school transfer, asked about duration, asked about parental participation, and she had done all of it while the records being used to justify concern were still being shaped largely by symptoms she herself had reported. I printed the insurance pre-screen and set it beside the counseling summary. Family has begun considering residential stabilization. The sentence looked different now. I still had no evidence that a clinician had recommended placement independently. What I had was evidence that Rebecca had been preparing for the possibility. I thought about Sophie asking me whether the doctors could make her go away. At the time, I had assumed she was frightened by something vague she misunderstood. Now there was an actual facility, an actual benefits inquiry, and an actual set of questions about transferring her school. I wanted to call Rebecca and ask one sentence. Why were you preparing to send my daughter away without telling me? But I knew what that would accomplish. She would learn exactly which record I had found, then have time to explain it before I found the records underneath it. Instead, I added Oak Ridge to the timeline. Date of first contact. Insurance inquiry. Questions asked. Rebecca listed as contacting parent, no final admission. I kept the wording precise because precision was the only thing separating an investigation from panic. Then I stared at the calendar. The Oak Ridge inquiry had not happened randomly. It occurred during one of my longer trips, within days of a behavioral appointment, and shortly after another event I had not noticed before. Someone named Jordan Cross had been at our house that same week. Jordan Cross was not a stranger. I had heard Rebecca mention him before, usually the way she mentioned contractors or people from networking events. She described him as a business consultant, helping her develop a wellness marketing venture she had talked about launching for more than a year. I had never paid much attention. Rebecca had always been ambitious, and I encouraged her to build something of her own. Jordan, as far as I knew, was another consultant with a polished website and a talent for making simple ideas sound impressive. What changed was the timing. I opened our shared household calendar first. Rebecca had entered Jordan's name several times under vague labels: strategy session, brand planning, investor prep. Then I compared those dates with the smart door history from our home security account. The system recorded guest codes, front door entries, and garage access. Jordan had been given a temporary guest code months earlier for business meetings. I had known that. What I had not known was how often the code was used when I was out of state. Charlotte trip, Jordan entered Tuesday afternoon and left 2 hours later. Dallas trip. His code appeared again. Nashville, another visit, 2 visits in the same week. The entries were not late at night. Nothing about them looked romantic or secretive by themselves. That mattered. I refused to turn a man visiting my wife while I traveled into an affair, simply because jealousy offered an easy explanation. Rebecca had told me he was helping with a business. The visits occurred during normal working hours. The records supported that much. Still, I added them to the spreadsheet. Date, entry time, exit time, my location. Then I placed the medical appointment dates beside them. The overlap was not perfect, but it was close enough to make me sit forward. On the Charlotte trip, Jordan visited the day before Sophie's first counseling intake. During Dallas, he came to the house 2 days before another behavioral follow-up. In Nashville, his code appeared the same week as the clinic appointment tied to the school support plan. Boston bothered me most. Jordan entered our house on Tuesday. Sophie had a behavioral appointment Wednesday afternoon. Rebecca contacted Oak Ridge later that week. I had been 3 states away reviewing documents, while those 3 events unfolded within 72 hours of each other. I checked whether Jordan's visits also happened while I was home. They did, but less often. A few were coffee meetings Rebecca had mentioned. One was a larger planning session with another woman, whose name I recognized, that kept the pattern from becoming too convenient. Then I opened my own calendar and compared when Rebecca knew I would be unavailable. Several Jordan meetings were added only after my travel was confirmed. Again, there was an innocent explanation. Rebecca might simply have used my absences to schedule work without disrupting family time. But one detail bothered me. On 2 dates, Sophie's appointment occurred within hours of Jordan leaving the house. The records did not tell me whether Sophie had been home during his visits. They only told me that Rebecca's business meetings and Sophie's behavioral treatment were beginning to occupy the same narrow windows. I thought back to something Sophie had said months earlier. That meant nothing at the time. I had called from Dallas and asked what she had done after school. She said, Rebecca had work people over, so I stayed upstairs. I had answered, okay, and asked about homework. Now that ordinary sentence returned with different weight. Work people. Upstairs. I still had no reason to believe Jordan had harmed Sophie, spoken to her, or even interacted with her. What I had was a second timeline that kept brushing against the first. For a few hours, the easiest theory was the obvious one. Maybe Rebecca was having an affair, and the medical story was a way to keep Sophie quiet or out of the house. The theory was dramatic, emotionally satisfying, and almost completely unsupported. That made me distrust it immediately. So I did what I would have done in a fraud case. I wrote the hypothesis down without treating it as fact, then asked what evidence would distinguish it from a legitimate business relationship. The answer was simple. I needed to understand what Jordan was actually doing for Rebecca. That meant looking where business relationships eventually leave footprints: contracts, invoices, payments, and applications. I did not know yet whether Sophie's medical narrative was the main plan or merely a tool. But for the first time, another name was appearing beside Rebecca's often enough that I could not ignore it. I started with accounts I was legally authorized to access. Rebecca and I jointly managed a family-owned LLC that held 2 rental properties and a small investment account. I had not reviewed its activity closely in months because nothing significant was supposed to be happening there. The first unusual item was an invoice from a company called Cross Strategic Partners. The description read market positioning and growth consultation. That might have made sense for Rebecca's wellness venture. It made less sense inside an LLC whose stated purpose was holding real estate investments. The amount was not enormous, $9,800. Large enough to notice, small enough not to trigger panic. The invoice had been paid from the LLC operating account 3 weeks earlier. Jordan Cross was listed as the vendor contact. I checked the supporting documents. There was no contract attached, no scope of work, and no email from me approving the expense. That alone did not make the payment fraudulent. Rebecca had authority to handle certain operating expenses. What mattered was whether the expense belonged to the LLC at all. Then I found a second item, a vendor payment for $4,200 to a branding company I did not recognize. The memo referenced launch materials. Again, possibly legitimate for Rebecca's venture, but completely unrelated to maintaining rental property or managing the investments the LLC actually owned. I kept going. Buried in the document folder was a draft credit application that had never been submitted through our normal bank portal. It described the LLC as a potential guarantor for working capital connected to a new consumer wellness business. Because the LLC used a shared document system, I checked its access history too. Rebecca had opened the financing folder repeatedly during my travel. Jordan had no direct login, which meant anything he reviewed would have reached him through Rebecca or through documents she exported herself. My name appeared in the financial profile. So did estimates of our household income, property values, and available liquidity. Some figures were accurate, others appeared pulled from older tax documents. The application was incomplete, and I could not tell whether anyone had formally presented it to a lender. Jordan's name appeared under business advisor. Rebecca appeared as proposed managing member of the new venture. I was not listed as an applicant, but the draft language suggested that assets connected to our family structure might support the financing. That distinction made my stomach tighten. I called our accountant and asked whether the LLC had approved any investment in Rebecca's venture. He said no. I asked whether he had prepared a credit application using the LLC as guarantor. Again, no, he sounded concerned, but I told him not to contact anyone yet. I did not accuse Rebecca of stealing money. At that point, I could not. The invoice might have been misclassified. The branding payment might have been reimbursable. The credit application might have been nothing more than a draft someone created while exploring options. But the records created a new question. If Rebecca's business activity was entirely separate from Sophie, why were the same dates beginning to appear in both files? I returned to the spreadsheet and added a fifth category, financial activity. The first cross-invoice had been created during my Dallas trip. The branding payment followed a Jordan visit during Nashville. The draft credit application had a metadata creation date from the week Rebecca first contacted Oak Ridge about residential screening. I stared at that date because I remembered it for another reason. Sophie had also been taken to a behavioral appointment that afternoon. It was one of the visits where Rebecca reported escalating defiance and irrational fear at home. I checked the transaction memo again. The LLC payment associated with Jordan's consulting work had been entered at 3:42 p.m. Sophie's appointment began at 4:15. Rebecca was listed as the accompanying adult. 33 minutes separated a business transaction from a behavioral appointment involving my daughter. That could still be coincidence. 33 minutes did not prove motive, fraud, or conspiracy. But the story was no longer divided cleanly into Rebecca's business and Sophie's supposed problems. The same people, dates, and absences were beginning to overlap. I printed the transaction memo and placed it beside Sophie's provider note. One document talked about consulting strategy. The other described my daughter as increasingly unstable. Both carried the same date. For the first time, I wondered whether Rebecca needed me distracted by Sophie for reasons that had nothing to do with Sophie. I called Rebecca the next afternoon from my office, after Sophie had gone home with my sister. I waited until I could keep my voice steady. I did not mention the insurance records, the Oak Ridge inquiry, Jordan Cross, or the transaction dates. I gave her only one small piece. The school mentioned some appointments, I said. Rebecca was quiet for half a second. Then she answered in the calm, reasonable tone she used whenever she wanted a problem to sound smaller than it was. Yes, I told you Sophie had been seeing people. I remember you saying she was stressed, I replied. I didn't realize there were that many appointments. Another pause. David, none of this was secret. You were traveling. I handled what needed to be handled. Her answer was polished enough to sound almost rehearsed. I let the silence stretch. At work, people often rushed to fill silence because they mistook it for ignorance. Rebecca did the same thing. Oak Ridge is only an option, David, she said. The moment the name left her mouth, I stopped breathing for a second. I had not said Oak Ridge. I had not mentioned residential treatment. I had not even used the word evaluation. All I had told her was that the school mentioned some appointments. Yet somehow she had jumped directly to the one facility I had discovered only hours earlier. The silence on my end lasted long enough for her to hear her own mistake. When she spoke again, the rhythm changed. "I assumed the counselor told you," she said. "Too quickly. They were supposed to keep both of us informed about possible next steps." "Maybe they did," I said. I kept my voice flat. "There's been a lot going on." Rebecca relaxed just enough for me to hear it. "Exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Sophie needs consistency, and lately you haven't been around enough to see everything." The old version of me would have challenged that sentence immediately. I would have listed every trip, every call home, every school event I had attended. Instead, I let her have it. Defending myself would have told her I was keeping score. I wanted her to think I was still confused, so I changed the subject. I asked whether Sophie's science project had been turned in. Rebecca answered easily. I asked if she had spoken to the counselor about missing assignments. She said yes. Within 2 minutes, we were discussing school logistics as though Oak Ridge had never been mentioned. That ordinary conversation taught me more than an argument would have. Rebecca did not sound like someone reacting to a sudden crisis at school. She sounded like someone managing a process already in motion. She knew the vocabulary, the facility, the next steps, and the explanation she expected me to accept. When we hung up, I wrote down her exact words. Not my interpretation, not what I thought she meant. "Oak Ridge is only an option, David." Then beneath it, I assumed the counselor told you. In forensic work, small wording changes often mattered more than dramatic denials. I compared the call to the timeline. Oak Ridge had been contacted weeks before Sophie collapsed. Rebecca had asked about eligibility, school transfer, duration, and parental involvement. Now she had volunteered the facility's name before I gave her any reason to believe I knew it existed. That still was not proof of why she had done any of it. It did not prove fraud, abuse, or conspiracy. But it proved something smaller and cleaner. Rebecca's knowledge extended beyond what she had admitted to me, and she had just exposed that gap without realizing it. I closed my notebook and looked at the spreadsheet again. For the first time, I stopped thinking of Rebecca as someone improvising after Sophie's collapse. The records were too old. Her knowledge was too specific. Now I knew she wasn't reacting to the investigation. She had been planning ahead of it. For 10 minutes after the call, I wanted to drive straight to Rebecca's sister's house and put every document on the table. I wanted to ask about Oak Ridge Jordan, the payments, the appointments, and the signature. Anger makes confrontation feel like progress. My job had taught me otherwise. The moment I showed Rebecca everything I had, I would also show her everything I did not have. She would know which records mattered, which dates I had connected, and which explanations she still had time to prepare. A confrontation would give Rebecca information. A timeline would give me answers. So I went back to work. I exported every school record in its original format. I downloaded the insurance claims, saved provider summaries, photographed the support plan, and created read-only copies in a separate folder. Then I backed the folder up twice and stopped editing the originals. I added dates, sources, and short descriptions to the spreadsheet. No adjectives, no conclusions. If a record said step-parent reports, I wrote exactly that. If a clinician observed Sophie as calm, I wrote calm. I wanted the chronology to survive, even if someone who disliked me read it later. Next, I requested source documents from the clinic that had uploaded the support plan. I asked for the original intake packet, acknowledgement workflow, appointment history, communication log, and any record showing how my signature had been obtained. I did not accuse anyone of forging anything. Then I called a family attorney named Melissa Grant. A colleague had used her during a custody dispute years earlier and described her as methodical, which was exactly what I needed. I told Melissa the story once slowly and sent only the documents I was legally entitled to possess. She listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she asked the question nobody else had asked. "What does Sophie herself know about what you're doing?" I told her almost nothing. I had asked 1 or 2 gentle questions and stopped when Sophie became uncomfortable. "Keep it that way," Melissa said. "Do not turn your daughter into your investigator. If she volunteers something, listen. Don't rehearse it with her. Don't ask the same question 6 different ways because you want a cleaner answer. Let a neutral professional handle anything that needs formal documentation." Her next warning was about Rebecca. Do not access accounts that belong only to her. Do not guess passwords. Do not install anything on her devices. Use shared records. records in your name, and documents you have a legal right to request. Clean evidence is worth more than dramatic evidence. I told her about Jordan and the LLC. Melissa asked whether I was an authorized manager and account holder. I was then preserve what you can access legitimately, she said. But don't contact Jordan, don't warn the lender, and don't start making accusations before we understand what actually happened. She also told me not to threaten Rebecca, not to post anything online, and not to call her family looking for allies. If this becomes a legal dispute, every angry message you send becomes part of the file. Your job right now is to be boring, accurate, and impossible to dismiss. That advice was harder to follow than it sounded. Rebecca had been shaping a story about my daughter while I traveled, and every new record made me want to move faster. But speed was exactly what could destroy the thing I was trying to protect. I created a master index that night. School, medical, insurance, travel, household access, financial, communications. Each document received a date and source. For the first time, the mess on my screen began to look less like betrayal and more like something I knew how to handle. By midnight, I was no calmer, but I was more useful. I could not control what Rebecca had done before I noticed. I could control what happened next. I would not educate the person who might be lying to me. I would let the records educate me first. Sophie came home the following evening after the doctor cleared her. My sister stayed through dinner so the house would not feel tense. Rebecca remained at her sister's place. I told Sophie only that the adults needed time to talk. She watched my face as if every answer mattered. When she spilled water, she apologized 3 times. I handed her a towel. "It's water, Soph." She looked at me as though she expected a second sentence, maybe a lecture or a warning. None came. We cleaned the table and finished dinner like nothing terrible had happened. Later, Sophie sat at the far end of the couch with her knees under a blanket. I did not mention the school file, Oak Ridge, or Rebecca's phone call. I asked whether going back to school felt scary. She stared at the television for several seconds before shrugging. "You don't have to go tomorrow if you're not ready," I said. "We can talk to the school together." Sophie picked at a loose thread. "Would that make it worse?" "Worse for who?" I asked. She shrugged again. "Everybody." I told her nobody would punish her for needing time. Then I asked whether she might prefer talking to someone neutral, a counselor who was not me, Rebecca, or anyone already involved. Sophie looked at me. "Would they write things down?" "Probably some things," I said. "Would Rebecca see it?" I chose my words carefully. "We can ask exactly what stays private and what has to be shared before you talk to anyone. You deserve to know the rules first." Sophie nodded once. "Maybe." I did not ask her to decide that night. We watched another episode before she spoke again. "Dad, if someone says something about me, do you believe them?" I turned down the television. Not automatically. I listen. Then I try to understand what actually happened. She looked at the floor. "Even if it's a doctor." "Doctors know a lot," I said. "But they ask questions because they need accurate information. If something about you doesn't sound right, you're allowed to say so." Sophie absorbed that quietly. Then she asked, "What if they already decided?" "Decided what?" I said. She shook her head. I felt the urge to keep asking, but I let the opening close. If Rebecca had taught Sophie that adults punish the wrong answer, then pressure from me would only prove the same rule. I wanted her to learn something different before I asked her for anything difficult. At bedtime, Sophie stopped halfway up the stairs. "Are you leaving this week?" I told her no. I had moved what work I could handle remotely. "Because of me?" she asked. "Because I want to be home," I said. She gripped the railing tighter. "Rebecca says work gets messed up when I need too much." The sentence was so casual that it took a second to register. "You needing me does not mess up my work," I said. "And my work is not your responsibility." Sophie looked away, embarrassed by something she had not done. Then she asked the question that changed the room. "If the doctors say I have to go away, do I have to?" I kept my voice steady. "Go away where?" She swallowed. "Somewhere. They help kids who are too hard at home." "I don't want to go," she said. "I can be better." I climbed 2 steps and stopped below her so she would not feel cornered. "Sophie, listen to me. You do not have to earn your place in this house. You are not something I'm trying to get rid of." Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. I told her no decision about her life would happen in secret and that nobody would send her anywhere, simply because someone described her as difficult. She watched me carefully, testing whether I meant every word. Then I asked the one question I could not leave alone. "Who told you the doctors wanted you to go away?" Sophie went completely still. Her hand stayed wrapped around the railing. I did not repeat the question. I simply waited while the house around us became quiet. Sophie stayed on the stairs for so long that I thought she might refuse to answer. Then she sat down 2 steps above me and pulled her sleeves over her hands. Rebecca told me, "The doctors think something is wrong with me, but you can't handle knowing." I felt the words land one at a time. I wanted to ask which doctors, what they had supposedly said, and how long Rebecca had been telling her this. Instead, I kept my voice low. "Okay." Sophie looked surprised that I did not immediately demand more. She said, "You're already stressed all the time," Sophie continued, "because of work. And if I keep making problems, you'll have to leave meetings or come home early, and then people might stop trusting you." She watched my face carefully. She said, "You could lose your job." For a second, I saw every airport gate, every late-night call, every time I had told Sophie I was busy but would make it up to her later. Rebecca had taken something true about my life and built a threat around it. That was what made it believable. Sophie rubbed her thumb against the railing. "Rebecca said she can handle it because she's stronger with this stuff. She said you get too emotional when it's about me." I almost laughed at the cruelty of that sentence. Instead, I asked, "Did she tell you not to tell me?" Sophie shook her head. "Not exactly, that answer mattered." "What did she say?" "She stared at the carpet. She said if I told you everything, you'd try to fix it, and then you'd miss work because of me. So I was supposed to let her handle it." There it was. Rebecca had not needed to threaten Sophie into silence. She had made silence sound generous, responsible, loving. Every time Sophie kept something from me, she could believe she was protecting my career instead of protecting the person who had told her to stay quiet. I moved 1 step closer, but stopped before reaching for her. "Soph, you are never responsible for keeping me employed." She looked down. "But what if they think I need more help?" "Then we get help," I said. "But you do not protect me by hiding what scares you." Her eyes filled. "You're not mad? At you?" "No." She nodded once, then asked, "Even if I caused all those appointments?" I kept my answer simple. "You didn't cause adults to make decisions without telling you what they were doing." That sentence seemed to release something in her. Her shoulders dropped, for the first time since the hospital. She still did not tell me everything. I did not ask her to. But the mystery had changed shape. Rebecca had not merely kept information from me. She had managed Sophie's understanding of me. I thought about the records describing irrational fear, defiance, and distorted perceptions. If Sophie objected to something Rebecca said, that objection could become another symptom. If she stayed quiet, Rebecca's version went unchallenged. Either response could be folded back into the same story. And somewhere inside that system, my daughter had been taught that telling me the truth might cost me my livelihood. That was not an accidental communication problem. It was control. The question was no longer whether Rebecca had hidden the medical narrative from me. I knew she had. The question now was why she needed that narrative so badly. Why did Sophie have to become the unstable child in every file? Why did Rebecca need to be the strong parent, the reliable source, the person professionals called first? I still did not have that answer. Sophie wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Can I go to bed?" I told her yes. She took 2 steps, then stopped again. "Dad, yeah?" She hesitated. "There's something else, but I don't know if it matters." I waited. This time, I did not ask a single question. She turned back toward me. "Remember when you went to Dallas for that case with the hotel people?" I did. It had been a 3-night trip in September. One night I came downstairs because I wanted water. Rebecca thought I was asleep. Sophie said the lights in my home office were on. The door was mostly closed, but she could hear Rebecca talking to a man. When Sophie pushed the door open, Jordan Cross was sitting across from Rebecca at my desk. Several folders were spread between them. She remembered the folders because one was bright blue and had a silver logo shaped like 2 overlapping circles. Another was dark green with a white label. My laptop was open beside them, even though I had taken my work computer to Dallas. This was the family laptop. "There were papers with your name on them," Sophie said. I saw David Hale at the top because it was big. She did not know what the papers were. She remembered numbers, boxes, and one page. Rebecca covered with her hand when she noticed Sophie standing there. "What happened then?" I asked. Sophie's mouth tightened. "Rebecca got mad, not loud," she explained. That would have been easier. Rebecca closed the laptop, stood up, and asked why Sophie was wandering around when she had school the next morning. Jordan did not say anything. "She told me to go upstairs," Sophie said. Then she came to my room later. Rebecca had apparently asked what Sophie saw. Sophie said she did not know. Rebecca told her she was confused because she was tired and had been getting worked up too easily lately. The next afternoon, Rebecca picked Sophie up early from school. Insurance records already told me where they went: the developmental clinic. It was one of the appointments where Rebecca reported increasing agitation, irrational suspicion, and difficulty respecting household boundaries. Now the date had context. Sophie looked embarrassed again. I told the lady I wasn't suspicious. I just saw papers. What did Rebecca say? Sophie took a breath. She said I was proving her point because I kept making normal things into scary things. I felt my jaw tighten. Then Sophie repeated the sentence that had stayed with her. This is exactly why you need more help. The words were not shouted. Rebecca had said them calmly in the parking lot afterward, according to Sophie, like she was explaining something obvious to a child who refused to understand. I asked Sophie about the man only once. You're sure it was Jordan? She nodded. He came to the house, but guy with the glasses. That matched what I knew. I did not ask whether he touched anything, said anything, or knew why Sophie was being evaluated. Instead, I asked what else she remembered about the office. Sophie closed her eyes. The blue folder had that silver circle thing, and one paper said something like cross. Maybe cross strategy? I don't know. She apologized for not remembering. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I wrote those details down only after Sophie went upstairs. Blue folder, silver overlapping circles, cross, David Hale, family laptop. Not conclusions, details. A 12-year-old should not be expected to understand financing documents, but she could remember colors, names, and what frightened her. Then I checked the spreadsheet. Dallas trip, Jordan at the house, Sophie saw documents. The next day, behavioral appointment. Rebecca reported worsening symptoms. The sequence was no longer theoretical. Something Sophie witnessed had been followed almost immediately by a stronger version of the story that she was unreliable. That did not prove the business documents were illegal. It did not prove Jordan understood what Rebecca was doing with Sophie, but it connected two worlds I had been treating separately. The financial timeline and the medical timeline had finally touched through one person, my daughter. Until then, I had been asking whether Rebecca exaggerated Sophie's problems. Now a harder possibility existed. What if the exaggeration had a purpose outside medicine? What if making Sophie look unreliable solved a problem Rebecca believed my daughter had accidentally created? The following morning, I sent Melissa a summary of what Sophie had volunteered, carefully separating her exact words from my interpretation. Melissa called within 20 minutes. Do not ask her to repeat it for you, she said. We'll arrange a neutral professional if formal documentation becomes necessary. Then she told me she had received source material from Oak Ridge. Not a final admission packet, a draft intake packet. Rebecca had gone farther than the preliminary insurance inquiry suggested. Oak Ridge had retained the information submitted during the intake process, including family history and proposed timing. Melissa sent me the packet through a secure link. I opened it at my office and read the first page twice. Sophie was described as emotionally unstable, increasingly oppositional, fearful, and resistant to treatment. The phrases were familiar because I had traced most of them back to Rebecca. The family history was worse. It described me as a father who traveled extensively and struggles to accept the severity of the child's behavioral condition. Another section said I had difficulty maintaining consistent boundaries because of guilt related to Sophie's mother. Nobody had ever asked me whether that was true. Rebecca was listed as the primary family coordinator. Under treatment goals, the packet discussed reducing conflict, stabilizing behavior, and creating enough distance from the home environment for Sophie to respond to intervention. The language sounded clinical. The underlying facts still came from the same disputed chain of reporting. Again, I reminded myself that Oak Ridge had done nothing wrong by receiving an inquiry. A residential program cannot independently know a family before intake. Staff evaluate what they are given. My concern was not that the facility existed. My concern was who had supplied the story and what that story was preparing to justify. Then I reached the scheduling section. A tentative intake window had been requested for the second week of the following month. I recognized the dates immediately. I was scheduled to be in San Francisco for 4 days on a litigation engagement I had confirmed weeks earlier. I read the dates again because my mind resisted what the page implied. Rebecca had not just asked what residential treatment involved. She had explored an intake window that began after I was supposed to leave town. If it moved forward, I might have returned to find Sophie already gone. There was no completed admission, no final authorization, no guarantee Oak Ridge would even accept Sophie after full evaluation. I kept repeating those facts because anger wanted to leap farther than the evidence. But planning did not need to be complete to reveal intention. Melissa agreed. This does not prove she could legally place Sophie without you, she said. It does show she was preparing logistics around a period when you expected to be unavailable. I asked what to do about the San Francisco trip. Her answer was immediate. Do not leave. I called my managing partner and told him I had a family emergency requiring me to handle the engagement remotely. He did not ask for details. Within an hour, my flight was canceled, the hotel was released, and another partner agreed to attend the in-person sessions. I did not tell Rebecca. When she texted later asking what time my flight left Monday, I looked at the message for nearly a minute before answering. Same schedule as before. It was the first time I had deliberately allowed her to believe something I knew was false. The choice did not make me proud. It made me focused. For months, Rebecca had built plans around the assumption that my absence was predictable. She knew when I flew, when I landed, when I was unreachable, and when Sophie would be alone with her decisions. This time, the calendar still showed San Francisco. My suitcase would still come downstairs. My car service would still appear on the shared schedule. As far as Rebecca knew, the same window she had prepared for was about to open exactly as expected. But I was not going anywhere. I spent the next morning looking at Jordan Cross, the same way I would examine an unfamiliar vendor in a fraud engagement. Not through private messages or guest passwords. Through public filings, corporate records, invoices already inside the LC, and documents I had every legal right to review. Jordan had spent most of his career in business development and private financing. He had worked for 2 investment firms, then launched Cross Strategic Partners, a small advisory company that promised founders help with capital, partnerships, and market expansion. On paper, nothing about him looked unusual. Rebecca's venture appeared in several draft documents under the name Havenwell Collective. The concept was a wellness marketing platform aimed at boutique clinics and family brands. I had heard her talk about it for more than a year, but I had never seen the financing materials behind it. Those materials told a different story. Havenwell needed money, not a few $1,000s for a website or product samples. The draft package projected a 6-figure launch budget, with credit available if certain guarantees were accepted. That was where my family LLC started appearing. The package referenced rental property equity, held inside the LLC household liquidity, and what it called anticipated family support. My income was listed beside those assets as evidence of financial strength. Individually, those details could have come from information Rebecca already knew as my wife. The problem was the language around approval. One draft described the capital structure as approved in principle by family stakeholders. Another note said, guarantor confirmation pending documentation. There was no signed resolution from me, no authorization from our accountant, no meeting in which I approved using the LLC. I did not write fraud in my notebook. I wrote unsupported. The next line became unverified. A proposed guarantee was not the same as a guarantee. A draft credit package was not a funded loan. Sloppy language was not automatically criminal language, and I needed to keep those differences clean. Then I found a spreadsheet created by Rebecca, stored in the shared LLC folder. It estimated how much borrowing capacity the family properties could support. My name appeared beside a column labeled Personal Strength. Jordan's initials appeared in comments suggesting how lenders might view the package. One comment bothered me more than the rest. DH comfortable in concept, paperwork later. I had never told Jordan I was comfortable with anything. I had never discussed Havenwell financing with him at all. If DH meant David Hale, then someone had summarized approval that did not exist. I checked email next, but only accounts and folders I was authorized to use. I found no message from me to Jordan, no conversation about guarantees, no approval of cross-strategic partners. The absence did not prove a false representation, but it made the phrase comfortable in concept difficult to support. The larger motive began to sharpen. Rebecca had access to financial information because she was my wife. She had access to the LLC because I had trusted her with routine management. She had access to Sophie because I had trusted her as a parent. Access by itself was not wrongdoing. But the same person had 3 kinds of access, and all 3 mattered to what I was now seeing: money, records, and the only child who had accidentally walked into the room while those records were spread across my desk. I thought again about the affair theory and discarded it. Maybe Rebecca and Jordan had some personal relationship I did not know about, but nothing in the records required one. Business was enough. Capital was enough. A witness who could be dismissed as confused might be enough. That possibility was uglier because it was practical. If Sophie's story about the office ever became inconvenient, Rebecca already had months of records describing her as anxious, oppositional, and prone to distorted perceptions. The narrative existed before anyone outside. The family knew there was something to question. Still, I forced myself to use the words my profession had taught me. The financing was unverified. The approval language was unsupported. The proposed use of family assets appeared unauthorized. Jordan's role was documented. Rebecca's intent was not. I was not going to outrun the evidence. By afternoon, I understood why Jordan crossed appearing in every timeline. He was not necessarily the architect of what had happened to Sophie. He was the business connection standing beside the money. And the money gave Rebecca a reason to need control over what the rest of us believed. I opened a new spreadsheet because the old one had become too crowded. Across the top, I created 4 sections instead of columns. Sophie's medical and school events, my travel, Jordan's visits and business activity, and financial documents or account activity. Then I sorted everything chronologically. The first month looked almost ordinary. A work trip, a counseling appointment, a Jordan meeting, a business invoice. Nothing sat close enough together to mean much. But as the months progressed, the gaps between the events became shorter. September 3rd, I was in Charlotte. Sophie had her first counseling intake. 2 days earlier, Jordan had been at our house for a strategy meeting. A draft Havenwell budget appeared in the shared folder that same week. Rebecca reported new problems with Defiance shortly afterward. September 19th, Dallas. Jordan entered through the front door with his guest code. Sophie later told me she saw papers carrying my name. The next afternoon, Rebecca took her to the developmental clinic. The provider note recorded escalating suspicion and difficulty respecting household boundaries. October brought another cluster. I was tied up in a deposition downtown. Jordan met Rebecca at the house before noon. That afternoon, a cross-strategic partners invoice was uploaded to the LLC folder. Within 48 hours, another counselor note repeated Rebecca's report of worsening behavior at home. November 17th was the date that refused to fit cleanly. I was in Nashville. Sophie attended the clinic connected to the school support plan. Rebecca was there. The plan later appeared with my signature and language stating it had been reviewed with a parent at the clinic. That date did not line up with the Jordan visit. It lined up with something else. A Havenwell financing draft created that morning and a comment about family approval added that evening. The signature on Sophie's plan sat between 2 financial events in the same day. December looked worse. I was in Boston. Jordan came to the house Tuesday. Sophie had a behavioral appointment Wednesday. Rebecca contacted Oak Ridge that week. A financing memo referencing family liquidity was saved Friday. 3 separate systems recorded events nobody had ever placed on the same page. I kept going into January, New York trip. Adolescent counseling. Another cross-related vendor payment. More language describing Sophie as resistant, fearful, and unreliable during family conflict. The pattern did not repeat perfectly, which made me trust it more than if it had looked designed for a courtroom. No single line proved anything. Jordan could visit for legitimate business. Sophie could need counseling. Rebecca could make a vendor payment. I could travel. A financing draft could be exploratory. The meaning appeared only when the sequence repeated around the same narrow windows. What mattered most was direction. The stronger behavioral descriptions tended to appear after periods when Jordan visited, business documents were created, or Sophie could have been around while Rebecca worked on Havenwell. The medical narrative seemed to intensify after the business activity, not before it. I highlighted every point where Sophie had actually been observed by a neutral adult. Those notes remained comparatively mild, quiet, anxious, tired, cooperative. Then I highlighted Rebecca's reports after the business clusters. Defiant, irrational, distorted, increasingly difficult to manage. The screen began to look less like 4 separate timelines and more like one process moving through 4 systems. Travel created opportunity. Business activity created risk. Sophie's presence created a problem. The behavioral record created an answer to that problem. That was still an inference, and I wrote the word inference across the top in capital letters. I needed facts strong enough to survive someone who disagreed with me. The greatest danger in pattern analysis is seeing intent where timing alone can explain events. Then I returned to November 17th. My signature remained the one detail the 4 timelines could not explain. If I had signed remotely, the pattern weakened. If the form had really been reviewed with me at the clinic, the geography became impossible. Everything else pointed toward Rebecca shaping events while I was unavailable. That signature could either destroy my theory or become the cleanest contradiction in the entire case. I did not know which yet. I only knew I needed the original record behind it. Before asking anyone else to explain Rebecca's conduct, I audited my own. That was uncomfortable, because my records were not as clean as I wanted them to be. Over the years, I had signed dozens of school forms electronically and given Rebecca broad room to handle routine family logistics. I found permission slips with my real signature, emergency contact forms, a consent for Rebecca to pick Sophie up from school, an older authorization allowing her to coordinate routine appointments when I was traveling. Every one of them could be used to make the later documents look less unusual. Then I searched my email history. The results were worse. Rebecca had sent me messages about school stress, scheduling conflicts, and counselor availability. I had responded to some with others received the kind of careless approval busy people send from airports. Sounds fine. Handle it. I found that exact phrase 3 times. In one thread, Rebecca had asked whether she should deal directly with the school counselor. Because I would be traveling, I answered. Yes, please take care of it. I trust your judgment. Reading those words made my stomach turn. At the time, I meant routine coordination. I did not mean create a behavioral history, explore residential placement, or speak for me about diagnoses I had never discussed. But meaning is harder to prove after years of informal trust. Melissa was the first person I showed the emails to. She did not reassure me. Rebecca will use these, she said, and they are relevant. I appreciated that answer even though I hated it. A useful lawyer does not protect you from inconvenient facts. Then the financial records produced another problem. One access log tied to the draft financing folder showed a login from a device registered under my household profile. The credential was mine. The system could not tell whether I had personally been sitting at the keyboard. I checked the date. I was traveling, but I had sometimes left a browser session active on the family laptop. Rebecca knew the household password. Years earlier, that arrangement felt practical. Now it meant a document could carry access history connected to me without proving who actually opened it. For several hours, I stopped thinking like the injured party and tried to build Rebecca's defense. David travels constantly. David delegates. David signs electronically. David authorizes Rebecca to handle school matters. David tells her to use judgment. David leaves shared financial systems accessible. From that angle, the story changed. Maybe Rebecca would say she believed my old permissions covered the school plan. Maybe she would say the financing materials were drafts, based on discussions I forgot. Maybe she would say I was rewriting our marriage after becoming frightened. The defense was not ridiculous. That was what frightened me. Lies are easiest to defeat when they are completely invented. The more dangerous version uses real emails, real absences, real permissions, and one narrow distortion about what those facts were supposed to mean. I went through every form again and marked which signatures I knew were genuine. Then I compared them with the disputed plan. The resemblance remained strong. Whoever created that signature, if it had been created, had access to excellent examples. I had supplied plenty over the years. I called Melissa again. Did I give her enough access that nobody will believe the difference between permission and manipulation? She was quiet before answering. Maybe someone will believe her at first. That is different from her version surviving the source records. That distinction helped. I did not need to prove I had been a perfect father or a perfect custodian of passwords. I needed to be accurate about what I authorized, what I did not authorize, and which records could independently establish the difference. So I added another folder to my case file, Evidence Against Me. The title felt ridiculous, but it kept me honest. Every broad authorization, every careless email, every shared credential went inside. If my theory could survive those facts, it might deserve to survive at all. I did not know then how quickly Rebecca would use exactly those weaknesses. I only knew that by auditing myself first, I had discovered the shape of her best argument before she ever made it. Rebecca realized something had changed before the week ended. I never learned whether the clue was my canceled flight, the records requests, or a call from one of the clinics asking her to confirm information. Whatever she noticed, she did not confront me privately. Instead, Melissa received a letter from an attorney representing Rebecca. The letter said, Rebecca had become concerned that I was interfering with Sophie's necessary care and attempting to reverse months of professional recommendations because I could not emotionally accept my daughter's condition. I read the first paragraph twice. Rebecca claimed I had pressured Sophie after the hospital incident dismissed clinical concerns, and created confusion around treatment. She said my sudden involvement was destabilizing a plan that multiple professionals had spent months developing. Then came the facts she knew would sting because they were true. I traveled frequently. I had missed school meetings. Rebecca had coordinated appointments. I had given her authority to handle routine educational and medical matters. I had written emails telling her to use her judgment. The letter placed those truths beside conclusions I did not accept. Because I traveled, Rebecca argued, I lacked first-hand knowledge of Sophie's home behavior. Because I delegated routine matters, she argued, I had supported the broader treatment process. Because I now objected, she called me inconsistent. The most serious section asked for an expedited family review, so Sophie's residential assessment could continue without what the letter called parental obstruction, driven by guilt and denial. Rebecca had taken the very phrase from the intake packet and turned it into a legal position. I called Melissa. Can she do that? She can ask, Melissa said. And based only on the existing record, the request will not look absurd. That was not the answer I wanted. The file shows months of concern. We know the source problems. A reviewer may not yet. Rebecca also contacted the school counselor. I learned that when the counselor called to say Rebecca had expressed concern that I was making Sophie question professionals who were trying to help her. I told the counselor I would not discuss allegations by phone and asked that everything be documented. That restraint probably sounded cold. Inside, I was furious. Rebecca had spent months speaking first, and now she was using the weight of those earlier statements to frame every objection I made as proof that I was the unreasonable parent. She did not need to invent my travel schedule. She only needed to interpret it. She did not need to fabricate my delegation. She only needed to stretch routine permission until it covered decisions I had never understood were being made. Then she discovered I had canceled San Francisco. She texted me one sentence, "So you lied about leaving?" I stared at it for a long time. I did not answer. An hour later, Melissa received a supplemental note accusing me of deceptive behavior and heightened control. Rebecca's strategy became clear. If I confronted her directly, I was aggressive. If I stayed quiet, I was secretive. If I questioned treatment, I was denying Sophie help. If I gathered records, I was trying to undermine professionals. Every move could be folded into the story, already waiting for it. That was the moment I understood how dangerous a pre-built narrative could be. Rebecca did not need to defeat the evidence immediately. She only needed institutions to view the evidence through the frame she had created before I entered the room. Melissa told me an emergency review had been scheduled. Not a final custody hearing. Not a decision about Oak Ridge. A preliminary meeting to determine whether Sophie's current care plan should continue while the conflicting claims were assessed. Even so, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time since the hospital, I was no longer simply investigating Rebecca. I was being evaluated alongside her. My travel, my emails, my parenting, my decision to cancel the trip, even my conversations with Sophie could now become part of the record. I looked at the folder labeled Evidence Against Me and understood why building it had mattered. Rebecca's strongest case was not made of pure lies. It was made of facts she could bend. To beat that, I could not be louder. I had to be more precise. The review was 3 days away. Rebecca had months of paperwork behind her and the advantage of having spoken first. I had timelines, contradictions, and one signature that still did not make sense. For the first time, I had to consider the possibility that the system might believe her before it believed me. The preliminary review took place in a conference room designed to keep everyone calm. Melissa sat beside me. Rebecca sat across with her attorney. A family evaluator, Dr. Elena Morris, had already received the school file, clinic summaries, Oak Ridge materials, and recent correspondence. For the first 20 minutes, I understood why Rebecca looked credible. The file showed months of concern before Sophie collapsed. It showed counseling visits, several providers, school accommodations, behavioral notes, and paperwork carrying what appeared to be my signature. From a distance, the record looked consistent. Rebecca spoke carefully. She never called me a bad father. She called me overwhelmed. She said I loved Sophie, but had missed the decline because work kept taking me away. Every accusation arrived wrapped in sympathy, making it harder to challenge without sounding defensive. She described herself as the parent who stayed. She attended appointments, answered school calls, coordinated counseling, and researched additional treatment. Then she said I became frightened after the hospital incident and suddenly rejected a process I had previously allowed her to manage. The uncomfortable part was that several facts supported her. I had traveled extensively. I had missed meetings. I had signed authorizations. I had written emails telling Rebecca to handle school issues. To an outsider, my sudden objections could look less like discovery and more like panic. Dr. Morris asked why I had not raised concerns earlier. Because I did not know the full extent of what was happening, I said. Rebecca's attorney pointed to my old emails. If I trusted Rebecca to coordinate care, he asked, how could I claim the process was hidden? I wanted to explain every contradiction at once. Melissa touched my wrist beneath the table, reminding me to slow down. I said routine authority was not informed consent to residential planning, and some underlying records needed closer examination before anyone decided what Sophie needed. Rebecca's attorney slid a summary forward. It listed anxiety, emotional dysregulation, oppositional behavior, irrational fears, and escalating family conflict. Beside those concerns were several professional names. On one page, it looked like multiple independent people had reached the same conclusion about my daughter. That was the lowest moment, because I could see how the story worked without everything I knew about its sources. Rebecca had built the narrative months before I knew I needed to challenge it. I was not entering a room. I was entering her finished version. Dr. Morris asked Rebecca whether Sophie needed Oak Ridge immediately. Rebecca lowered her eyes. I believe we should follow the professionals and keep every option open. It was a smart answer. She did not sound eager to remove Sophie. She sounded reluctant, careful, and responsible. Then Dr. Morris turned to me. And you believe the recommendations are unreliable? I shook my head. I believe some may be based on information whose original source disappeared through repetition. I'm asking that we separate observed behavior from caregiver-reported behavior before making any decision. For the first time, Dr. Morris stopped writing. Do you have examples?
Melissa handed her 2 records.
One described Sophie as calm during session, while documenting severe behavior reported by Rebecca. A later summary repeated that severe description, without clearly identifying where it originated. Dr. Morris read both pages, then requested the earlier clinic note. After comparing them, she asked a question that changed the room. Do we have the original source records from each provider, or only the later summaries shared between offices? Nobody answered immediately. Rebecca's attorney said the summaries reflected professional conclusions. Dr. Morris nodded. They may. But if we are making decisions about residential care, I want the source material, original intake forms, direct observations, parent reports identified as parent reports, referral records, and the original authorization history. My pulse changed when she said authorization history. I did not smile or look at Rebecca. I simply wrote the phrase down. For days, I had been fighting a story built from summaries. Now the evaluator wanted the layer underneath them, where every statement still had a source. The review ended without anyone winning. Sophie would remain home while the records were gathered, and no residential move would occur before the assessment. Rebecca still looked credible. I still looked late. But for the first time, the process was moving backward through the paperwork, instead of forward through her conclusions. The source records arrived in batches over the next 3 days. Melissa and I stopped reading summaries first. We started with the earliest note from each provider and traced every serious statement forward, marking who actually observed it, who repeated it, and who originally supplied the information. The difference was immediate. One clinician personally observed Sophie sitting quietly, avoiding eye contact, and answering questions in short sentences. Sophie herself said, school felt stressful and home felt tense. Then, in the same note, a separate section began. Stepmother reports frequent explosive reactions when limits are set. That sentence appeared again 2 weeks later at a different practice. This time, the wording had changed to history of explosive reactions and severe oppositional behavior. The second clinician had not witnessed either one. The record showed the phrase had been imported from the earlier intake material. A third provider later summarized Sophie as having persistent oppositional behavior across settings. I checked the original appointment note. Sophie had been cooperative throughout the visit. The phrase across settings did not come from direct observation. It came from a summary that had already absorbed Rebecca's description. The same thing happened with irrational fears. Rebecca originally reported that Sophie worried excessively about punishment for small mistakes. A later clinician wrote persistent irrational fears regarding consequences. Another summary shortened it further to irrational fears. By then, the caregiver source had disappeared completely. Melissa placed 4 pages beside each other on the conference table. This is what the evaluator needs to see, she said. Not because any doctor did something wrong. because these 4 records do not represent 4 independent observations. They represent one statement traveling through 4 files. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Rebecca had repeatedly said multiple professionals agreed Sophie was deteriorating. Technically, several professionals had documented the same concerns, but documentation was not the same as independent confirmation. Sometimes multiple doctors agreed only because multiple doctors received the same caregiver narrative. We asked the school counselor to identify which behaviors she had personally seen. She was careful. Sophie had appeared anxious, tearful on 2 occasions, and reluctant to discuss home. She had never seen Sophie become aggressive, threaten anyone, or behave in the explosive way described in several summaries. Sophie's science teacher said something similar. She had noticed fatigue and one episode of shaking hands before a presentation. Otherwise, Sophie completed work, followed instructions, and rarely disrupted class. The teacher did not call Rebecca dishonest. She simply confirmed which behaviors had never occurred in her classroom. That was exactly what I needed, not allies' sources. The stronger our case became, the less useful anger felt. Every witness who calmly said, "I did not observe that," removed another layer of certainty from a story that had looked settled only because nobody had traced it backward. We found copied language in the Oak Ridge intake packet, too. Distorted perceptions during conflict came from a counseling summary. That summary copied language from a developmental clinic. The developmental clinic traced it back to Rebecca, describing Sophie as misreading normal family boundaries after the night she saw Jordan in my office. The phrase had evolved from a disputed family incident into something that sounded almost clinical. By the time Oak Ridge received it, nobody reading the packet would know the original event involved Sophie seeing documents with my name and then being told she had misunderstood what she saw. Dr. Morris requested a revised source map showing each concern beside its origin. When Melissa sent it, the document looked less dramatic than Rebecca's summaries, but far more precise. Some concerns were real. Sophie was anxious. She feared disappointing adults. She had become withdrawn on certain days. But the most severe claims remained different. Explosive behavior, pervasive defiance, distorted perceptions, unmanageable home conflict. Those were not findings independently reproduced by multiple clinicians. They were allegations repeatedly carried forward from one caregiver, then gradually separated from the name of the person who first made them. That was the first real reversal. Rebecca still had months of paperwork, but the paperwork no longer spoke with one voice. Once every statement was returned to its original speaker, the apparent consensus began separating into observation, repetition, and assertion. For the first time, I felt the narrative shift without me raising my voice once. We had not proven why Rebecca built the story. We had proven something more basic. The file did not remember its own sources accurately. And once the sources returned, the certainty began to disappear. With the source map finished, I returned to the document that started everything, the student medical and behavioral support plan. The clinic finally produced the original workflow record, not just the PDF the school had received. This version included timestamps, routing notes, and the acknowledgement method. One line mattered immediately: parent acknowledgement completed in person. Beneath it was a timestamp, November 17th, 2:14 p.m. The clinic was less than 20 minutes from our house. According to the record, the parent whose signature appeared on the form had reviewed it there that afternoon. I opened my calendar. November 17th was already familiar because it sat at the center of several timelines. I had been in Nashville working on an emergency corporate matter, but a calendar entry was not proof. People reschedule meetings. Flights change. Memory fills gaps. So I treated my own alibi like any other claim. First came the airline receipt showing I landed in Nashville the previous evening. Then the hotel folio. Useful, but still incomplete. A person can leave a hotel. I needed evidence placing me somewhere specific at the relevant time. The building visitor system from our client's Nashville office showed my badge issued at 7:48 that morning and returned after 6. Meeting minutes listed me as present for sessions beginning at 9, 11, and 1:30. My initials appeared beside action items recorded during the afternoon discussion. At 1:57 p.m., a catering receipt charged to my corporate card showed coffee delivered to the same conference floor. That helped, but receipts can be handed to someone else. I kept looking. The strongest evidence appeared in a transaction completely unrelated to Sophie, Rebecca, or our family. During the Nashville matter, One subsidiary needed an officer affidavit executed before documents could be released to outside counsel. I had signed as a witness to financial representations, and because of the dispute, the attorneys required the signature to be notarized in person. The affidavit showed my signature at 2:03 p.m. Central Time. The notary block identified a Tennessee notary and the downtown Nashville office where the signing occurred. 11 minutes later, according to Sophie's clinic record back home, I supposedly completed an in-person parental acknowledgement hundreds of miles away. I checked the time zones twice, then a third time. The clinic timestamp was local time. Nashville was 1 hour behind. That meant the events were separated by roughly 71 minutes. Still nowhere near enough time for me to travel from a Tennessee conference room to a local behavioral clinic. Melissa warned me not to celebrate yet. Documents can contain data entry errors, she said. A clinic employee might have selected the wrong acknowledgement method. A timestamp might reflect upload rather than signing. We need the source behind the source. She was right. We asked the clinic to explain its workflow. An administrator confirmed that completed in person was generated when staff marked a parent acknowledgement as physically reviewed at the office. The timestamp reflected completion of that workflow, not a later school upload. That narrowed the possibilities. Either the clinic's workflow had been entered incorrectly, the signature had been attributed to the wrong parent, or someone had presented the form as mine when I was not there. I still refused to decide which explanation was true without more support. Then the Nashville attorneys sent the visitor log from the conference suite itself. It showed me entering the notarization room shortly before 2 and returning to the main conference afterward. Meeting notes resumed with one of my comments recorded minutes later. The geography became harder to explain innocently. I called the Tennessee notary whose stamp appeared on the affidavit. She remembered the matter generally, but would not rely on memory alone. I keep a journal, she said, for every notarization. I asked whether records from November were still available. Yes, she answered. I asked Melissa what that would prove. It proves location, she said, not authorship. We still need to establish how the clinic received the signature and who supplied the acknowledgement. But if the journal confirms you were in Nashville, anyone claiming you personally reviewed that form at home will have a serious chronology problem indeed. That was the first moment the signature problem stopped feeling abstract. Somewhere in Tennessee was an original journal created independently of my marriage, Sophie's treatment, and Rebecca's story. If it placed me in front of that notary, then the form at home was no longer just suspicious. It was geographically impossible. While Melissa worked on the clinic records, I returned to the financing files. The deeper source documents had finally arrived from the lender's compliance team, and they clarified something the drafts had only hinted at. Havenwell was not simply exploring capital. Rebecca and Jordan were actively trying to make the package financeable. The package leaned heavily on assets Rebecca did not control by herself. It clearly referenced equity inside our family LLC, projected personal guarantees, household liquidity, and my income history. Several pages used language suggesting those resources would be available once final documentation caught up with preliminary approval. Again, I separated what existed from what was implied. The family LLC existed. The properties existed. My financial statements were real. What did not exist was my consent to pledge those resources. I found no signed guarantee, no LLC resolution, and no email where I approved the structure. One lender note made the gap explicit, awaiting documentary confirmation of DH support. Another said Jordan had represented that family backing was expected. A later memo described David Hale as supportive in principle. The words kept getting stronger, even though no corresponding authorization appeared anywhere in the source file. Then the dates began answering the motive question. The lender requested additional proof of authorization during the same week. Sophie saw Rebecca and Jordan inside my office. The request asked for updated asset schedules, ownership information, and confirmation that family resources could support the proposed credit. Sophie had walked in while those materials were spread across my desk. She remembered my name, the cross-folder and pages. Rebecca quickly covered. The next day, Rebecca took her to the developmental clinic and reported worsening suspicion, boundary problems, and distorted interpretations of ordinary events. The timing alone did not prove Rebecca invented symptoms because Sophie saw financial paperwork. But the financing correspondence added pressure that had not been visible before. Rebecca and Jordan had a deadline. The lender wanted stronger authorization. Sophie had unexpectedly witnessed the exact activity Rebecca might later need to explain. 3 days after the lender's request, Rebecca asked whether Oak Ridge could begin screening Sophie without both parents present at the first contact. The following week, another provider summary described Sophie as increasingly unreliable when discussing conflict at home. Those events now sat inside the same financial window. That was when the purpose of the narrative finally became practical. Rebecca did not need every doctor to diagnose Sophie with something severe. She needed enough documentation to make any uncomfortable statement from Sophie sound questionable before anyone decided whether the statement deserved investigation. If Sophie said she saw documents with my name, Rebecca could say Sophie misread ordinary business paperwork. If Sophie said Rebecca became angry, the file already described emotional conflict. If Sophie challenged Rebecca's version, the record already contained language about distorted perceptions and oppositional behavior. Residential placement would make that advantage even stronger. Sophie did not need to disappear forever. She only needed to be away from the house, separated from ordinary access to me, and surrounded by a file that encouraged adults to interpret her objections through Rebecca's established narrative. Meanwhile, the financing process could continue. Jordan could answer lender questions. Rebecca could provide additional documents. If the package closed before I understood what had been represented in my name, the dispute would become harder, more expensive, and more complicated to unwind. I felt sick when the logic finally connected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was efficient. Rebecca had access to Sophie's care, access to family financial information, and access to my schedule. Each access point solved a different problem created by the same plan. Melissa cautioned me again. Motive is still an inference, she said. We can show timing, representations, source problems, and disputed authority. Let the decision-makers infer why, I agreed. Calling Rebecca's purpose proven before the record supported it would only weaken everything we had built. The source documents also showed no legitimate reason. Sophie's treatment needed to move at the same pace as the financing. Those were separate decisions on paper. Yet each time the lender pressed for stronger support, Rebecca's description of Sophie became more severe, and the possibility of removing her from the household moved another step forward. But privately, I finally understood the shape of it. Rebecca did not need Sophie gone forever. She needed Sophie not believed long enough for the financing to move forward, and every medical record that made my daughter look unstable bought Rebecca a little more time. The next review began with a document nobody in the room had created for this case. Melissa placed the support plan on the table, then the clinic workflow behind it. According to both, I had personally acknowledged Sophie's plan at the local clinic on November 17th. Rebecca's attorney repeated what she had said before. I had signed the plan. I had discussed it. I had authorized Rebecca to coordinate treatment. Melissa did not argue. She placed a photocopy of a Tennessee notary journal beside the form and asked Dr. Morris to compare the times. At 2:03 p.m. Central Time, the journal showed me physically present in Nashville, signing an unrelated corporate affidavit before a notary. The notary had recorded my identification, document type, signature, and location. She had also provided a sworn statement confirming the entry was hers. Then came the business records. Visitor logs placed me inside the Nashville conference suite before and after the notarization. Meeting minutes recorded my participation that afternoon. Corporate card activity supported the location. None of those records knew anything about Sophie, Rebecca, or our family dispute. The clinic form said, I acknowledged Sophie's plan in person hundreds of miles away shortly afterward. Dr. Morris looked at Rebecca. How do you explain that? Rebecca's face remained composed. He may have signed electronically earlier. The clinic could have entered the acknowledgement later. Melissa opened the clinic source record. Their administrator has confirmed this timestamp reflects an in-person completion workflow. Rebecca shifted slightly. Then perhaps the office selected the wrong option. David signed many things remotely. I was handling routine matters with his permission. That was version 2. The first had been that I signed and discussed the plan. Now the signature might have been electronic, the clinic might have made an error, and my authorization might somehow have covered everything. Nobody interrupted her. The documents did not need help. Melissa moved to the medical source map. Severe descriptions such as explosive behavior, distorted perceptions, and unmanageable conflict had appeared across several providers. But trace backward, most began with Rebecca's reports. The clinicians had repeatedly documented Sophie as quiet, anxious, withdrawn, or cooperative during direct contact. The school records told the same story. Teachers had seen fatigue, tears, and anxiety, but not the severe behavior later presented as professional consensus. Dr. Morris asked Rebecca whether she had been the source of the home reports. "I was the parent who was there," she answered. Melissa nodded. "Exactly." Then she placed the Oak Ridge communications beside the medical timeline. Rebecca had contacted the facility, discussed eligibility, school transfer, duration, and intake timing before I knew residential treatment was under consideration. The proposed window aligned with a business trip I was expected to take. Rebecca said she was only exploring options. Melissa did not dispute that. She moved to the financial chronology. Lender requests for stronger family authorization had intensified during the same period. Rebecca's reports about Sophie became more severe, including the appointment immediately after Sophie saw Jordan and financial documents inside my office. Jordan's files described family backing as expected and me as supportive in principle. No signed guarantee supported that language. No LLC resolution authorized it. The lender's source file still showed requests for documentary confirmation. Rebecca said the financing documents were drafts and had never become final. Again, nobody argued. Drafts were drafts. The problem was accumulation. I supposedly approved Sophie's plan in person while I was in Tennessee. Then I supposedly approved it electronically. Then maybe the clinic made an error. Then perhaps my routine authorization meant specific approval was unnecessary. Dr. Morris looked down at Rebecca's earlier written statement. "Here you said David reviewed the plan with you and understood the recommendations." Rebecca answered, "Generally, yes. But today you're saying he may not have reviewed this specific document." Rebecca paused. "I'm saying he authorized me to handle Sophie's care." Melissa finally leaned forward. Her voice never rose. "Those are different claims. He personally signed it. He signed electronically. The clinic recorded it incorrectly. His older permission made the signature irrelevant. Which version are you asking us to believe now?" For the first time, Rebecca had no immediate answer. She looked at her attorney, then at the documents spread across the table. The problem was no longer one disputed signature. Every explanation she offered protected one record by contradicting another, and the records had stopped moving with her. I stayed silent. I had imagined that moment ending with anger or some dramatic admission. Instead, it ended with Rebecca staring at 5 independent sources she could not rewrite at the same time. I did not need her confession. I needed her versions to meet each other. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came through separate doors, carried by people who had no reason to protect me or punish Rebecca, and no reason to rewrite what happened. That mattered. I did not want a spectacle. I wanted every decision made from the same set of records. Dr. Morris recommended that any residential placement be paused until Sophie completed an independent assessment with a neutral clinician while questions were resolved. The court agreed. Oak Ridge was no longer a destination waiting on a calendar. It became an option that could not move forward unless new, independently supported evidence justified it. Rebecca also lost the ability to coordinate Sophie's school and medical care by herself. Future appointments required notice to both parents. School staff were instructed to copy me on support discussions. Any major treatment change needed documented agreement or review through the process already underway. The contact restrictions were narrower than my anger wanted and broader than Rebecca expected. She could not use private appointments, school meetings, or indirect messages to pressure Sophie. Contact had to follow the temporary conditions set by the court while the disputed records were investigated. Melissa warned me not to treat those restrictions as a victory. "Temporary orders are about stability, not punishment," she said. I understood. Sophie did not need to watch adults celebrate her stepmother losing access. She needed to know nobody could quietly make decisions about her anymore. The signature issue moved separately. The clinic preserved its workflow records. The Tennessee notary provided the journal entry. The disputed acknowledgement, source file, and related communications were referred for formal review. Nobody declared the answer in the conference room. The records would be examined where they belonged. Rebecca's family court position changed immediately. Weeks earlier, she had looked like the consistent caregiver trying to help a resistant father understand his daughter's needs. Now, every confident summary had to be read beside its source, and every claim of my approval had to survive the chronology. The business consequences moved even faster. The lender's compliance department froze. Havenwell's financing review. After questions arose about authority to use family assets and whether expected guarantees had actually been approved, they requested direct verification from the LLC's authorized parties before considering anything further. Without that verification, the financing could not close. Payments tied to cross-strategic partners were flagged for supporting documentation. Drafts that had once sounded impressive became exactly what they were, drafts. Anticipated family support meant nothing when the family member supposedly providing it said he had never agreed. Jordan's tone changed next. He did not call me. He sent Rebecca a formal email, copied to counsel, stating that cross-strategic partners had relied on information supplied by Havenwell regarding family support and would cooperate with any document review. It was not loyalty. It was distance. The message sounded careful, almost defensive. The social consequences were quieter, but probably harder for Rebecca. She had presented herself to teachers, counselors, family friends, and professionals as the devoted stepmother, fighting for a child whose father could not accept the truth. That image depended on her version reaching people before the source records did. Once the school, clinicians, evaluator, attorneys, and lender were looking at original records, she could no longer tailor a different explanation for each room. I did not call her friends. I did not send anyone the file. I simply made sure the people making decisions had the same documents. Rebecca called me 3 nights after the review. The temporary restrictions allowed communication about necessary logistics, but this call had nothing to do with Sophie's schedule. Her voice sounded different, not polished, not calm. "You destroyed everything," she said. For a moment, I thought about every answer I could have given. I could have mentioned Oak Ridge, the signature, the lender, the months of reports. I could have reminded her that Sophie had been terrified to tell me the truth because she thought it might cost me my job. Instead, I said, "This isn't a conversation we should have." Then I ended the call and sent the communication to Melissa. There was no perfect line waiting for me, because the point was never to win an argument with Rebecca. The point was to stop her version from controlling Sophie's life. Later that night, I understood what Rebecca meant by everything. She meant the plan, the financing, the authority, the image, and the advantage of being the person who spoke first. I had not destroyed those things. Her choices had created records. I had only put them in order. 3 months later, Sophie's life looked less dramatic, which was exactly what I wanted. She met weekly with a therapist chosen independently of Rebecca, me, and the school. Some sessions were difficult. Others ended with Sophie asking whether we could get tacos on the way home. Her school record was not erased. That would have been another kind of dishonesty. Instead, disputed descriptions were clarified. Caregiver-reported statements were identified as such, and new observations were added. Sophie was still anxious sometimes. She was also bright, funny, stubborn, and 12 years old. The biggest change was quieter. She stopped asking whether every mistake meant someone would send her away. If she forgot homework, she complained about homework. If she argued with me about bedtime, she acted annoyed instead of frightened. Ordinary conflict began feeling ordinary again. I changed my work too. I did not quit, sell the firm, or promise Sophie I would never travel again. That would have turned fear into another form of control. I reduced unnecessary trips, delegated more engagements, and protected specific days that belonged to home. At first, I overcorrected. I checked every school email twice. I asked too many questions after appointments. Sophie finally looked at me over breakfast and said, "Dad, you know you don't have to investigate my math class, right?" I laughed because she was right. Being present was not the same as watching every minute. I had spent months believing my failure was simply absence. It was more complicated. The real failure had been allowing Sophie to believe that telling me the truth could threaten our relationship, my work, or her place at home. Rebecca's case continued through the proper channels. I stopped asking Melissa for updates that did not affect Sophie's immediate safety. The disputed signature, financial representations, and treatment records belonged to investigators and attorneys now. My daughter did not need our kitchen turned into a permanent courtroom. One Saturday, Sophie invited 2 friends over and left cereal bowls, markers, and half a science project across the dining table. 6 months earlier, she would have apologized before I noticed. This time she shouted from upstairs, "Don't touch the volcano. It's supposed to look terrible." That sentence made me smile longer than it should have. Recovery was not one dramatic moment. It was a child taking up space again. It was leaving a mess without assuming the mess changed how I felt about her. It was arguing, laughing, forgetting, and coming back downstairs. A few weeks later, Sophie walked into the kitchen while I was making coffee and dropped a paper beside my mug. "You actually have to sign this one," she said. I looked down and saw a school permission slip for a science museum field trip. For a second, neither of us moved. The page was completely ordinary. Student name, emergency number, lunch option, parent signature. But I could not look at the blank line without remembering another form that had carried my name and nearly helped someone else define my daughter's life. Sophie noticed my expression. "Dad, it's just the museum." I picked up a pen. "Do I need a notary?" She rolled her eyes. "Please don't make this weird." That made me laugh, and then I signed my name exactly where the school asked. Sophie picked up the page and inspected it with exaggerated seriousness. She compared the signature to something imaginary, narrowed her eyes, then nodded. "Yep, that one looks real." I shook my head. "Get to school." She grabbed her backpack and headed toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back. "You're coming to my game Friday, right? Wouldn't miss it." She nodded, as if that answer required no further proof, and ran outside. I stood there listening to the door, close behind a kid going to school like any other kid. Not a troubled child, not an intake packet, not a behavioral summary, not a witness in a financial dispute. Just Sophie, my daughter. For months, adults had filled pages with descriptions of who they believed she was. Watching her leave that morning mattered more than all of them. I still make my living finding things that do not reconcile. Dates, signatures, transactions. Stories people tell after the paperwork already exists. But this case taught me something no ledger ever had. A record can tell you where someone says they were. Being there tells your child who you are. If you found a document carrying your signature that you knew you had never signed, what would you check first? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about fathers protecting their families when the truth finally surfaces stay with you, subscribe for the next one.